This is John with wesleygospel.com. Um, I'm going to give some thought about aspects for interest in the supernatural. Now, when I say the supernatural, I'm referring to it in a general sense. Now, when I say that, don't get alarmed, because I'm coming from a biblical point of view on that. So when I say the supernatural, what I mean is, when people are into the supernatural, they fall into two categories. There's people who are devoted to Jesus Christ in the supernatural, and then there are people who are devoted to the devil in some way, shape, or form. There are many forms that he takes, right? But it's two sides. It's either God's side or the devil's side in that. And I'm going to kind of use the table of contents of Jeff Doles' book, Miracles and Manifestations of the Holy Spirit in the History of the Church. It's kind of like a structural guideline for what I'm going to be saying here. And I was just thinking about, historically some of the reasons that may give rise to supernatural movements, both sacred and profane, in the past history. And when I look at the first really supernatural movement outside the church fathers, there was the Desert Fathers movement in the 300s AD in the northern Egyptian desert with Anthony and Hilarion and other monks. And what gave rise to interest in the supernatural among them was not really so much the supernatural. It was fleeing from persecution, because there was a lot of violent persecution. And so it just started out as not a quest for spirituality, not a quest for miraculous gifts, not a quest for spiritual experience, not that I know of, but more so just more like a survivalist impulse, like a prepper like impulse. Like, I got to get out of here. There's so much violence in the city. I got to just get out of here and learn how to just survive out there in the wilderness. So it was more of like a survivor, like a Bear Grylls type of a scenario starting out, than it was, I want to become a monk and get in touch with the power of the Holy Spirit. It was more like Bear Grylls mentality. Like, at first starting out, like, they were just like, I got to get out of this city or I'm going to be tortured to death. And so they got out there, and lo and behold, life got a lot simpler. Life got a lot quieter. And, a lot of them were like, well, I might as well devote myself to the spiritual life. One thing I can do out here is pray. And that's where a lot of dreams and visions started to come into the picture, because their minds were not distracted. So the first thing that was discovered with that movement was that less distractions gives rise to more spiritual experiences. Less distractions, less city, metropolitan type distractions, less distractions of that nature, less business type distractions, less social distractions, less political distractions, less distractions, more stillness of mind equals more spiritual experiences, whether good or evil. And so that was the first thing that kind of gave rise to the interest in the supernatural that you can look back in church history with the Desert Fathers movement. After that movement was over with, after John Cassian had written the conferences and kind of crystallized what it meant to be prophetic, what it meant to be a monk, then you had the whole Middle Ages where there was all these monastic movements, and they were like, I want to live like the Desert Fathers. That was always the point of reference. Whether it was St. Patrick or St. Benedict or St. Francis, they would always look back and be like, I want to be like the Desert Fathers again. That was always that was always the thing. Like, let's start a new monastic order because this monastic order is not enough like the Desert Fathers. Let's create a new monastic order that's more like the Desert Fathers. It was always about imitating the Desert Fathers and getting back to the Desert Fathers again, because they had tapped into something so profoundly supernatural, and they wanted to get back to that. So, again, like, they crystallized it. Like, there was a reason to the madness. Like, people, like, this much hours of contemplative prayer will yield this result. Study this much of the Bible per day. I mean, they had gotten, like, some of them had gotten so routine about it that you could almost expect the Holy Spirit to appear on command almost. They had, I mean, I don't want to say they had control over the Holy Spirit, but it's not, Star Wars it's not a far cry from that. Like Star Wars the Jedi was literally based off of Catholic monks in the Middle Ages. Like, and so the idea that they could handle the Force at will, it's not a far cry. Like, some of these guys, like, were so in union with Christ by prayer that to ask for a loaf of bread to appear out of nowhere was not like a really big prayer. Like, they would have like miracle contests and be like, "Oh yeah, we'll do this," and like, let's see who can pray up the best miracle. I mean, in some cases, like, that's the way it was, and you either accept that or you reject that. But if you're in the in crowd and that's like what you get used to, it's like, oh, here's another miracle because the needs are so pressing, and you pray out of needs, and needs are met and needs are felt. And it's also a context of missionary work, like charismatic missionaries, right? So there's all these needs surrounding them as well. Once the Reformation started, you have to understand, like, the Reformation was all about getting back to doctrine, getting back to Romans, and getting back to doctrine. And so the intellectual culture of the Protestant Reformation was coming out of the Renaissance, which was science oriented and philosophy oriented and kind of deistic. And it was all about the intellect, right? And the academy and the university, and having like a master's and doctorates in theology and like biblical studies. And so it was all about the intellect. Not that Thomas Aquinas hadn't had that, not that the Dominican order hadn't had that, but we're getting away from this mystical monasticism and just being about the academy. And so a lot of the supernatural emphasis of spirituality was just kind of cut off, especially through King Henry VIII and the destruction of monasteries in England. And there was just so much that had been accomplished was just lost across Europe in that area because of the Reformation. However, the Scottish Covenanters preserved it, and if you study the Scotsworthies, Chapter 7 of Miracles of Manifestations by Jeff Doles is really comprehensive. It goes way more further than Jack Deere does in his book, Why I Am Still Surprised by the Voice of God. He has something like along the lines of 12 different people with really long extracts of their prophetic gifts and stuff. And so the prophetic spirituality that exists in the monasteries continuationist among the Scottish Covenanters who were Protestant Reformer Protestant pastors in Scotland for about 120 years, from the time of Luther way up until the early 1600s. So in Scotland, the need for the prophetic and faith for miracles continued to be so strong in Scotland that a movement like that was able to be sustainable. So the culture was welcoming towards the mystical experience, whereas down in London it was not so much, because as you can see, Scotland's more of a country type of an area, unless you're talking about the city of Edinburgh. It's kind of a pastoral environment, shepherds and sheep and stuff. Whereas when you look at London, it's just a business center. People are distracted. There's not like a whole lot of mysticism going on there, right? So when people are distracted with natural things, and there's schools and academies and business offices all over the place, one does not give themselves to prayer, silence, and spiritual experience uh, perceptions. Their ability to be more perceptive of the spirit realm is distorted by constant business, constant politics, constant distractions of all things swirling around in the big city. So it seems that every time spiritual experiences or Christian mysticism has really blown up in the supernatural area, it's been out in the desert. The desert fathers, the monks, isolated out in the country, right? The Scottish Covenanters, why? Because they're way up in Scotland, out in the country, right? It's always these people in the country who are pulled away from the city and their minds are contemplative and quieted down and are able to become more spiritually sensitive to the spirit realm around them and to the spirits around them, whether good or evil. And faith is able to increase as a result of spiritual experiences sort of building upon one another and increasing the person's faith and awareness for that sort of thing. I'm not going to say that if you live in the city that you're not going to have spiritual experiences, but there's a less likelihood for you to have spiritual experiences if you're living in a big city, because there's just so many distractions, way too many distractions. You almost, if you really want to have spiritual experiences, you can almost write it down as an infallible rule that you need to live in the country. I mean, I'm not going to say, I grew up in Raleigh, and I felt the presence of God at my Pentecostal church every single Sunday. So you don't have to be in the country, but what I'm saying is that you need to be at least with people who are from the country or something country, because those types of people have more faith for that because they're more spiritually sensitive for some reason. There's less distractions with those types of people, and as a result of this undistracted state, right, they can become more spiritually perceptive. They can hear better. Now, with that being said, there's also some philosophical elements that can go in to certain categories of people, I think, getting interested in the supernatural, whether it's for witchcraft or whether it's for a prayer life in the Christian life, whether it's for good or for evil. And I think that those people oftentimes come from dysfunctional families, and as a result, their family members are no longer a distraction to them. People who often have really supportive families, really great families, are oftentimes their minds are drawn to this natural realm because their families are so great, and it's as if they have all these things in heaven too. Their minds are always brought down to earthly things where their family is. And so when people have dysfunctional families, right, they tend to escape from the physical realm mentally and put themselves somewhere else where they feel safer, in the spirit realm, with God, with Jesus and the Holy Spirit, in prayer. And so that becomes the safe spot for them to escape to. And so it seems that when things are bad in a person's personal life, in their family life, they can be more driven by that or propelled or spurred along by that into a prayer life and become more sensitive towards the Spirit of God. Because this world has nothing to offer them, so might as well spend your time praying and getting closer to God, right? There's that element. There's also the element, I would have to say, of angst. There's an element of angst, a sense of protest against the superficiality of society, Okay, I don't want to use the word antisocial, but what I do mean is that there might be a sense of dissatisfaction and frustration about the world around them. Um, they can see through the superficiality of the business world. They can see through the superficiality of the political realm, of even dysfunctional families. They can see through everything, every institution in this world that just doesn't work, everything being off kilter. It just makes them want to, again, escape, a sort of escapism that can be healthy if directed towards Christ, um, because this world has nothing to offer them. Another element is the philosophical deadness of deism, agnosticism, and atheism. If they grow up in environments where the church is just deistic and is completely unsupernatural, right? They're going to either A, turn towards something like Satanism, because at least they promise supernatural experience, or B, they might turn towards Pentecostalism, hopefully they'll do that, and embrace a more supernatural form of Christianity. So it seems that that also has a role to play, where I think that happened with St. Francis. He grew up in a kind of a nominal Christian family. Same thing with John Wesley, kind of a nominal Christian family where they went through the motions, and then there was this crisis point where these people were like, I have to have a spiritual experience or I can't be a Christian. I need to have a spiritual experience. This is not good enough, right? This deistic form of Christianity is just not good enough. And so you see that with St. Francis, you see that with John Wesley, and I'm sure that if I did a really close study, I could find that in other people. I think St. Patrick had the same element as well. His dad was a political junkie. His dad was a government worker. His dad was political and business minded, and there was dysfunction there. And he wanted to have a spiritual relationship with God. And he toyed around with witchcraft first before he became a Christian. So again, there's an example of a person who's just interested in the supernatural in general, right? Because his dad was a politician. His dad was into the natural world in every way, shape, or form, and that just didn't interest Patrick. And Patrick wanted to escape from that. He saw it was, shallow, superficial, and he wanted something more exciting in his life. He wanted the awe and the wonder of the supernatural world, right? So oftentimes, like people like St. Patrick, St. Francis, they come from wealthy families, sometimes politically involved families, stately families sometimes, and they know all there is to know about the greatness of the world of business and politics, and it's just completely stupid to them. Like, I've heard that people can experience God on a miraculous level. This interests me more than all of this stuff. And so that's what I have to say. And I think that another element is the punk element. Now you might think, well, that's just a stupid rock genre that, I haven't paid much attention to and I'm not interested in it. And no, I'm not talking about music styles here. I'm talking about the idea of punk that existed in the late 70s, in the 80s and the 90s, which I identified with for a little while. And what you have there is, again, sort of a reaction to an atheistic and agnostic materialistic culture where people are just angry at what they're being given and how superficial it is, right? So there's this sort of this anger and this angst against it all, right? And an anger against inequalities like racism and things like that. And so sometimes you'll find these people either A, turning to witchcraft because they want the supernatural in their life, or B, if they become a Jesus freak, they become charismatics sometimes because they want to go all the way. They're hungry for the spiritual side of existence. They're not satisfied. The world is shallow and superficial and vain to them. The business world, the political world, even the family world, because it's the dysfunctional family theme. So everything becomes superficial and shallow, like an eggshell, right? And they need God, His Spirit. Or if they go in the devil's direction, then it's witchcraft, right? So they need something some form of supernatural and mystical experience, because everything else is just shallow to them. Academia, family, politics, business, everything, nothing interests them. Athletics, nothing interests them. It's all a sham, right? It's all a sham. And once that sort of it's all a sham mentality kind of, rolls over them, now they're ready to seek the supernatural world. And hopefully they will not seek Satanism. They will seek the Holy Spirit instead, and seek Jesus Christ and his power and the baptism in the Holy Spirit. But it's in other words, it's got to be supernatural or nothing, for these types of people. The shallowness of deism, the shallowness of the business world, it's just all vanity. It's like Ecclesiastes. Basically, it's an Ecclesiastes mentality where you're like, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Everything the world has to offer is meaningless. I need the Spirit of God. That's what I need. God bless you out there. This is John with wesleygospel.com.